right, I think we can start. It's a great honor to introduce Professor Roger Allen. In the prime of his youth, he is the father of modern Arabic literature studies. He has played a key role in introducing the study of modern Arabic literature to literary studies. Whereas, you cannot hear me? Now it's better?
Yeah.
Okay, whereas before it was part of philology and area studies only. Roger Allen obtained his PhD in modern Arabic literature from Oxford University in 1968 with a study on Muhammad al-Muwaylihi's renowned narrative Hadith Isa ibn Hisham and its translation into English as Isa ibn Hisham's Tale, which was later published in book form as A Period of Time. He later also oversaw an edition of the complete works of al-Muwaylihi. From 1968 to 2011, Roger Allen was Professor of Arabic and Comparative Literature at the University of Pennsylvania, the oldest professorial post in Arabic in the US, dating back to 1788. I read that on your webpage and was really impressed.
I wasn't the first professor.
Now retired, he continues to teach there part-time. Among his many publications are the Arabic novel, An Historical and Critical Introduction, which was published in a second edition in 1998 and also in Arabic translation. The Arabic Literary Heritage, published by Cambridge University Press in 1998, and then as a paperback edition as the Introduction to Arabic Literature in 2000, and there's also an Arabic translation of this one, right? Published in 2003 in Cairo. He has served as president-elect of MESA, the Middle East Studies Association of North America, and as the editor of several journals and book series. Moreover, he has conducted many workshops on Arabic language teaching and translation, and authored the textbook, Let's Learn Arabic. Last but not least, he has translated a large number of works of modern Arabic fiction into English. 27 novels, among them novels by Najib Mahfouz, Abdurrahman Munif, Jabra Ibrahim Jabra, May Telmisani, and Hanan al-Sheikh. Translations we are working with along the original Arabic texts in our graduate course on Arab modernisms this spring, and I'm very happy that the entire class is actually in the lecture now, is here. Roger Allen is also a musician, and those of you who came early were lucky to hear him play the piano. So he plays the piano and the organ, and as we discussed earlier today, we hope to invite him back to AUB to give a workshop in translation as well as a concert, hopefully in the second hall. But first, we are very happy to welcome Professor Roger Allen at AUB. This is his first of hopefully many visits to AUB. He has visited Beirut before, once, in 1963. So it's time for him to come back, and I'm very happy that he's coming back and giving a talk here at AUB. So please join me in welcoming Professor Roger Allen.
Thank you, Professor Sonia, and also Professor Bilal for this invitation. It's a great honor and pleasure to be here and to be able to share some thoughts with you today.
It's a bit the mic.
Also?
Maybe could you ask maybe the technician if they can do something? I don't know how to get the sound. Bilal, maybe it's fine.
1, 2, 3, 4, testing.
It's fine.
I won't start again. As the Egyptians say, as Professor Sonia has just mentioned, this is my second visit to Lebanon. The first was in 1963, when I had been studying Arabic for precisely 8 weeks at Oxford. And I owe a tremendous debt still to Lebanon, because I discovered during that visit that the Arabic I had learned at Oxford, including the unforgettable sentence, "The lame girl is in the yellow room," you know, and all that, was not much help when it came to negotiating with the service taxi drivers in Meydan Shuhada in order to take me back up to Ali and then across to Souq al-Gharb and to Shabnan, where the British school was. That really was the beginning of a process whereby I discovered, firstly, that there were actually people who spoke Arabic, and secondly, that modern Arabic was indeed a subject worthy of further investigation, in spite of valiant attempts by my teachers at Oxford to suggest that modern Arabic was a very flippant subject in which to engage. I'm glad that that at least has changed, and that's been a large part of what I've tried to do throughout my career. That's of course not to cast cold water on the efforts of my colleagues who prefer to work on pre-modern Arabic literature, but merely to say that the relationship between the two continues to be as important as it has always been. I have to say too that looking around this audience and seeing who's sitting here, I have the uneasy impression that I'm doing what conforms with the English phrase, bringing coals to Newcastle. Newcastle is a town in the north of England famous for its coal mines. So, but anyway, I've been asked to talk to you about translation, and let me just say that I'm not going to talk today about translation theory or translations I've done or about translating modern texts. I was asked a few years ago to prepare a study of the role of Arabic as a cultural conduit throughout the history of the emergence of this very important world language, and that is essentially what I am doing in this particular study, focusing on translation activities in one direction or another in 4 locations in 4 separate centuries. But I begin with the wisdom of one of my and our wonderful Moroccan colleagues, Abdel Fattah Kilito, in his book Les Arabes et l'art du récit, which he wrote in French. Translation is often presented as an act of love, a sign of openness and tolerance. We invoke the periods in which it flourished with a tender nostalgia, Baghdad in the 9th and 10th centuries, Toledo in the 12th. However, reality is a bit less idyllic. Translation usually functions in a context of competition and rivalry. Kilito's views on the role of translation in intercultural connections over the centuries and the specific eras he cites serves as a useful prelude for me in this essay, in which I seek to examine a number of historical eras during which Arabic and its modes of written expression were deeply affected and deeply affected other cultures and the processes of translation. Our narrative begins with the chronological moment at which the culture of the Arabian Peninsula, where the Arabic language originates, began to assert its presence beyond its borders, namely in the city of Damascus. It was the process whereby the incipient community of Muslims expanded rapidly in the 7th century from the Arabian Peninsula and its twin holy cities of Mecca and Medina, initially to the north and soon thereafter both east and west, that brought the Arabic language into contact with other cultures and thus automatically instigated translation moments. The rapid conquests of the Muslim armies, the speed of which is attributed by historians, among other factors, to a series of conflicts between the Persian and Byzantine empires during the pre-Islamic era that weakened both, brought the Arabic language into contact with those and other cultures in an entirely new and different context. The Umayyad dynasty of caliphs, Arabic Khalifa, successor of Muhammad, assumed control of the fractured Muslim community in about 661, the Common Era, following a disastrous schism that led to the appearance of the rival claims of Sunnis and Shia. The Umayyads established their capital in the ancient city of Damascus in present-day Syria. Inscriptions, papyri, and coinage from the initial decades of the dynasty suggest that while Arabic, the language of the Quran and prayer, was playing an increasing role in public life of the newly conquered territories, much of the emerging caliphal administrative bureaucracy continued to be conducted by functionaries, whether converts or not, whose primary language was not Arabic, in particular Persian, Coptic, and Byzantine Greek. It was the Caliph Abd al-Malik, the instigator of the building of the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, who transformed the situation by requiring that henceforth all official transactions be conducted in Arabic. Most significantly, Arabic became the medium of the Chancery, the Diwan al-Rasail, an agency whose importance was automatically enhanced as the Islamic dominions increased in breadth and linkages with more remote regions and cultures. The Amazigh in North Africa, for example, became matters of routine administration. The existence of this institution demanded the creation of a cadre of specialists in different aspects of administration and diplomacy. It was within the context of training such a group, known in Arabic as Kuttab, singular katib, meaning literally writer, but as my colleague Michael Carter has suggested long since, actually bureaucrat, that the principles of the new form of prosaic discourse in Arabic and the need for translation from a variety of languages arose. The long-acknowledged pioneer in this field, the establishment of codes of conduct and writing styles, was Abd al-Hamid, known as Al-Katib. Joining the Umayyad dynasty as a young man, he became the protege of Salim Abu al-Ala, who was appointed head of the division by the Caliph Hisham. Under his mentor's tutelage, and thereafter in a distinguished career of his own, Abd al-Hamid established not only the yardstick for courtly prose, but also the qualifications needed for a professional bureaucrat. I'll pause here just to mention, of course, Professor Ahsan Abbas and his pupil, Wadid al-Qadi, are both the primary experts on this subject, both of them intimately connected with this institution. Tantalizingly, we have no specific information for the source for one of his most famous epistles, Marwan's testimony to his son, but Wadid al-Qadi, the acknowledged expert on his career, notes that they doubtless included translations and adaptations from Persian and Greek. The context of this epistle and its linkages to earlier models of so-called mirrors for princes would thus appear to reflect the relatively early existence of translation projects within the administrative community of the Umayyad court. It was to the instructional framework of that community that Abd al-Hamid contributed another epistle, this one a letter to the secretaries, Risala al-Kuttab, in which he identifies the functions and moral qualities required for those who aspire to such positions. The first major intellectual figure who devoted his career to translation was a participant in this courtly and bureaucratic environment that Abd al-Hamid had described, namely Ibn al-Muqaffa', the Arabic name adopted by the Persian-speaking Ruzbih. Ibn al-Muqaffa' served the same Umayyad bureaucracy, but at some distance from the caliphal capital, in the South Asia region from which he himself hailed. His primary claim to fame lies in two factors. Firstly, his acquired mastery of Middle Persian, which gave him access to the cultural treasures of the ancient Indo-Persian tradition. Secondly, his similarly acquired ability to translate many works from that tradition into Arabic. It would appear that the content, style, and imagery contained in these translations had the same transformative effect on the Arabic writerly community, represented by Abd al-Hamid's successors, as did the translation of the King James Bible into English and its literary styles. Ibn al-Muqaffa' translated a number of important works on Persian history and wrote a number of treatises of his own, including another set of instructions for bureaucrats, the great book of etiquette, Kitab al-Adab al-Kabir, and notice I'm translating adab there as etiquette. But he's best remembered for his translation of a collection of animal fables, the Panchatantra, that he rendered into Arabic as Kalila wa Dimna. Those are the names of two jackals who sit with the king and in response to questions regarding the proper conduct of rulers, narrate a series of fables involving animals, birds, snakes, and so on. Here too, of course, we have another example of the mirrors for princes genre, one that interestingly enough finds a further, albeit later, example within the Arabic cultural heritage in the original Middle Eastern collection of tales known in Arabic as Alf Layla wa Layla. Some 260 tales of Indo-Persian origin that, in their popular Arabic version, completed no later than the 14th century, were to create such a cultural storm in 18th century Europe following their translation into French by Galland. This led in turn to the later emergence of a European version of that collection, which among other things added to the original Middle Eastern tales a set of animal fables very much akin to Kalila wa Dimna. I move now to Baghdad. Through their writings and use of translation, Abd al-Hamid and Ibn al-Qaf'a established the foundation for the emergence of a new kind of scholarly community. In Michael Cooperson's words, the characteristic persona of classical literary culture in Arabic, the Katib Adib, or secretary littérateur. This subdivision of learning and scholarship, which came to be termed adab in Arabic, the term used today to translate the Western concept of literature, originally implied etiquette or good manners, but was gradually adapted by the writerly community to mean discourse with pedagogical, moral, and entertainment functions. The practitioners of this craft, the udaba, were soon to become important participants in the life of the Muslim court. The career of Ibn al-Qaf'a, someone who functioned effectively as an administrator for one caliphal dynasty, only to be executed on the orders of the caliph of its successor, the Abbasis, serves as an appropriate illustration of the turbulent era in which the Muslim community found itself embroiled in the mid-8th century. The Abbasi revolt that ousted the Umayyads from caliphal authority was initiated in the northeastern provinces of the increasingly expansive Muslim dominions. It was thus hardly surprising that one of the earliest decisions of the new caliphate was to move the court from Damascus to the purpose-built city of Baghdad further to the east. For the next several centuries, Baghdad, the core of which was constructed as a round city, with the caliphal palace at its center, became the glittering monument to a scholarly and cultural environment that was the cynosure of European eyes, fabled for its institutions and the multifaceted learning that they fostered and preserved. And we all know about the Shirley brothers being sent by Queen Elizabeth I of England to this particular court. The community of secretary littérateur had laid the foundation which now expanded and flourished. Symptomatic of the enormous range of this intellectual community's concerns and interests is the career of Amr ibn Bahr, a genuine polymath universally known by his unfortunate nickname Al-Jahiz, the boggle-eyed one. Author of a copious number of epistles, compendiums of poetry and anecdote, literary criticism, his topics range from learned theological discussions to witty comparisons of different categories of human beings, to the delights and dangers of singing girls, and to the utterly bizarre behavior of misers, all written in a style that rapidly came to be regarded as the almost unattainable model. With Al-Jahiz and his many successors, the Adib now became an important figure in the life of the caliphal court and those of many other political centers of local authority that grew across the length and breadth of the Muslim world. The intellectual curiosity of these communities and the multicultural nature of their populations serves as incentives for a long-term translation movement of major proportions, one that was to have enormous implications for the history of Western thought, its preservation and transmission. As one scholar observes, for about 200 years, the translation of ancient Greek philosophical and scientific texts was the focus of extraordinary expenditure of time, effort, and money. This vast cultural enterprise, which absorbed and created vital energy, involved players from nearly all sides, from Syriac Christians, who constituted the principal core of translators, to the Arab caliphs, and an Andalusian mix of others in between. which I will come to in a minute. A number of factors seems to have combined to create such a fertile environment for intercultural exchange and thus for a major increase in translation activities. Among the most significant was the close proximity to the new capital city, Baghdad, of a series of major other cultural centres that often dated back to the pre-Islamic era and had for centuries been significant contributors to the cultural and intellectual heritage of other religious and linguistic communities. One such was the city of Jundishapur, founded in the 3rd century of our era under the Persian Sasanian dynasty, where a renowned academy had long been a major intellectual centre, particularly famous for its medical expertise and research. The status of that academy, with its accompanying hospital, had been much enhanced by the arrival in the 6th century of Nestorian Christians who were escaping the intolerance of the Byzantine authorities, what my colleague Dimitri Gutas terms, this is hard to say, Constantinopolitan orthodoxy. That's a difficult word to say. Who rendered a good deal of Greek learning into Syriac. By the time of the early Abbasi caliphs, therefore, the intellectual community based at Jundishapur had become a fascinating blend of Persian, Indian, Jewish and Greek traditions. Its prestige was obviously further enhanced when the Abbasi caliph hired experts from the academy hospital to serve as their personal physicians. Slightly further afield than Jundishapur were the Nestorian centres of Edessa and Nisibin, both on the southern border of present-day Turkey, which were also to benefit from the arrival of scholars fleeing Byzantine intolerance. In addition to an interest in medicine that linked them to the academy at Jundishapur, the scholars at these institutions also formed the repository of mathematical and astronomical learning that was being translated into Syriac. A further prominent intellectual centre and community was that of the Sabians in Harran, in the same district of southern Turkey, who with their combination of language knowledge and learning were to provide many important translators and translations. It was thus the encounter of this wealth of accumulated wisdom and research in both Greek and Syriac, with the opportunities offered by the intellectual movement established by the Abbasi caliphs in Baghdad, that served as the stimulus for an enormous project: the translation of inherited Greek, Persian and Indian learning into Arabic. The process was effectively instigated by the second Abbasi caliph al-Mansur, and as Dimitri Gutas notes, intensified during the caliphate of his great-grandson al-Ma'mun, who came to power following a civil war that pitted the different factions of the Abbasi family against each other. As this translation movement proceeded, it involved nothing less than the rendering into Arabic of the bulk of secular Greek learning in philosophy and science, thus including such fields of astronomy and astrology, alchemy, mathematics, music, zoology, medicine, pharmacology, optics, and so on. Generations of translators began not only to translate themselves, but also to train a new generation, often including their own offspring, who would continue and expand the project into new topic areas and refine the translation process itself. Among the most famous translators among these successive generations were Orthodox speakers of Greek, such as Abu Yahya ibn Batliq, Patricios, his son Yahya ibn Batliq, who was to be criticized for his bad Arabic style, Qusta ibn Luqa, Constantine son of Luke, Nestorians such as Hunayn ibn Ishaq, arguably the greatest translator in this movement, and his son Ishaq ibn Hunayn, and Abu Bishr Matta ibn Yunus, Thabit ibn Qurra, both of them members of the Sabian sect, and at a later date Yahya ibn Ali, a student of Matta ibn Yunus. What is particular interest about this elaborate and lengthy movement, about which, as Gutas notes, we need a lot more exacting research, is the precise nature of the translation activity itself and the principles which lay behind it. The first and most obvious issue is that, at least at first, the translation involved a previous conversion of the original Greek into Syriac, the language of many within the Christian communities. The subsequent transfer of those versions into Arabic could thus only be as accurate and effective a rendering of the original as was the initial process of translation into Syriac. One of the most famous instances of this involves a Greek text which has been central to literary theoretical studies in Europe for centuries, Aristotle's Poetics, or at least that part of it which was preserved through this very translation process. The above-mentioned Abu Bishr Matar ibn Yunus's Arabic version of the text was based on a Syriac translation that clearly failed to reflect the cultural significance of several crucial Greek terms. Tragedy was rendered as panegyric, and comedy as satire. As the movement developed, different methodologies were applied to the process of translation, ranging from a quest for an exact semantic equivalence in rendering the technical terms in scientific works, to a process in other fields that involved conveying the sense of a phrase or sentence in the target cultural context. What seems clear, however, is that while there may indeed have been a refinement of translation technique as the movement proceeded, the criteria applied involved decisions concerning appropriate discourse in the target culture, as much as, or even more than, a quest for literal accuracy. Hunayn ibn Ishaq is particularly famous for his determination to acquire a superb knowledge of Greek so that he could not only translate into Arabic from either Syriac or Greek, but also supervise the training of a new generation of translators who could rework earlier Arabic versions. This enormous and intensive exercise in intercultural communication seems to have lost some of its momentum towards the end of the 10th century. Like all such incidents of cultural transformation, there was no abrupt termination, but rather a gradual process whereby new circumstances brought with them different sets of priorities. As Dimitri Gutas notes, a primary factor seems to have been that all the works of Greek origin that seemed to scholars at the time to be important had been well rendered into Arabic, often as the result of one or more revisions. A new phase had started in which Arab Muslim scholars would use the translated repertoire as a starting point and take the various sciences to new heights. Ibn Sina in medicine, Al-Biruni in astronomy, Al-Khwarizmi in mathematics, and Al-Farabi in philosophy. The availability of paper, an understudied subject, as a recording medium, the profession of copyist, warraq, and collector reflected in the career of Yahya ibn Adi and his contemporary Ibn Nadim, the author of the famous shelf list Al-Fihrist, provides a tantalizing reflection of the textual riches that were then available, and the existence of libraries such as Beit al-Hikmah, all of these features contributing to the continuing and increasingly widespread availability of a scholarly repertoire that was to make its way across the entire extent of the Muslim world. I should say, Dimitri Gutas is at some point pains to point out that Beit al-Hikmah was never a translation center. It was a library of translations, but it had no translation activities. I now move again to the city of Toledo in Al-Andalus. By the 13th century, when the translation movement in Al-Andalus was reaching its zenith, the region had already witnessed several centuries of profound cultural transformation. As my late lamented student, Maria Rosa Menekal, a primary authority on this integrative approach, points out, the culture created by a new Muslim society was from the outset multiracial, multicultural, and multilingual. As Muslim values and the Arabic language began to assume a dominant place in society, Latin was gradually transformed from the prestige language of the pre-710 source culture into the target language, by means of which the intellectual heritage of Islamic learning writ large, imported, analyzed, interpreted, and greatly enhanced by the scholars and translators of Muslim Al-Andalus, was to be transferred to other European communities of learning. Arabic rapidly became not only the major language of textual communication, but also through a variety of dialectal forms, the primary language of communication used by Muslims and non-Muslims alike. The vigorous Jewish community in Spain, which had viewed the Muslim invasion as a positive change in their life, adapted rapidly to the new situation, ushering in an era of linkage between the sister Semitic languages of Arabic and Hebrew that was to the mutual benefit of both communities and the cultural artifacts they produced through translation of each other's languages. In addition to Arabic, Hebrew and Latin and transfer processes between them, there were also various colloquial forms of Hispano-Romance, Hispano-Arabic and Ladino, examples of which were to be recorded in written form as more popular literary genre joined their more prestigious counterparts. The linguistic scenario this created was, in Menocal's graphic term, that cacophonous delight. It goes without saying that both the interweaving of different communities, Muslim, Jewish and Christian, through marriage, conversion and day-to-day interaction, and the degree of mutual communal tolerance that was fostered under the broad umbrella of Islamic rule were to provide a natural environment for translation activities, the maintenance and expansion of which was only further stimulated by the enormous quantity and variety of newly rendered materials in Arabic that continued to reach the peninsula from the east as a result of the movement that I have just discussed. The intellectual environment of Cordoba of the 10th century was to be described by one German nun, Hrothwitha of Gandersheim, I hope I say that right, okay, as the brilliant ornament of the world, and the city's libraries, with their prodigiously large collection of volumes, were to become the envy of Europe. Following the lengthy reign of Abdurrahman III, tragic civil strife and intercommunal conflict led to the arrival in Al-Andalus of puritanical Amazigh forces from North Africa known as Al-Murabitun, the Al-Murabids. They and their even more puritanical successors, the Al-Muwahhidun or Almohads, sought to eradicate symptoms of what they deemed Andalusian society's lax adherence to pure Islamic values that they sought to maintain and impose on others. The demise of Cordoba as a center of authority was to be swift, but while the Almoravid incursion clearly had political and even doctrinal consequences, cultural developments seem to have been largely unaffected. As an illustration of this cultural center and the different relations established between Muslim and Christian rulers, we can move further to the north, where, as Carol Hillenbrand notes, I'm sorry, not Carol, her husband, Robert Hillenbrand notes, a Christian monarch, Alfonso VI of Castile, gained control of Toledo in 1085 and began the process of turning that centrally sited city into a major center for cultural exchange and translation. During this period of several centuries, Toledo was to serve as a major center of translation activities, most especially after the establishment in Toledo of a school for translation and translators by a Christian archbishop of the city, and I insert here parenthetically when I participated in a European project called Beirut, the place where we met was exactly that school. It's still there. The city became an obligatory destination for intellectuals and translators from all across Europe. Any listing of such residents would be lengthy, but a few merit particular attention. Peter the Venerable, the redoubtable abbot of the French Benedictine monastery of Cluny, at this time the largest church in Europe, came to Toledo himself in 1142, anxious to pursue his declared interest in Islam by having the text of the Quran translated. The translator he located, Robert of Ketton, was an English scholar who had learned Arabic and was translating the wealth of Arabic mathematical texts into Latin, including those devoted to the subfield of al-Jabr, which we know as algebra. However, he was persuaded to undertake the translation of Islam's sacred texts into Latin, which appeared in 1143 as Lex Muhammad Pseudo-Prophet. In his own writings on religion, Peter the Abbot was able to make use of works composed by another Peter, Petrus Alfonsi, the name adopted by Moses Sepharadi, a Jewish convert, on the occasion of his baptism in 1106. Given the intellectual focus of much of Petrus Alfonsi's life and work, it's perhaps ironic that his most enduring and popular contribution has remained his Disciplina Clericalis, priestly discipline, a collection of philosophical wisdom illustrated through examples of fables and animal tales. A work which is clearly based on earlier examples that, like so many other texts, genre and topics, arrived in Al-Andalus from further east, exemplified by such collections as Khalida and Dibna mentioned earlier. Petrus Alfonsi's aphoristic collection in Latin, with its framing techniques and variegated source materials, provide one source of information for such foundational European classics of Western literature as Boccaccio's Decameron and Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. An indication of the international scope of this translation movement, based in Toledo, can be gleaned from the names of the translators. Alongside Robert of Ketton, there was Adelard of Bath, Plato of Tivoli, and Gerard of Cremona, the last of whom was a contemporary and associate of the renowned Spanish archdeacon and translator Dominicus Gundisalvi. One suspects that contemporary translators and those who study their work today will be all too familiar with the fact that while we know which topics and in many cases which specific works were translated by these and other translators from Arabic and Hebrew into Latin and later into Castilian Spanish, little or nothing is known about the careers of the translators themselves. Little private gripe there on my part. They are anonymous carriers in the transmission of knowledge whose names scarcely interest anyone. A perhaps unfortunate exception to such an attitude on the part of subsequent scholarship may be seen in one translator who does seem to have created and retained a reputation. Michaelis Scotus, Michael the Scot, although there's doubt as to his actual origins, whose primary claim to fame, at least until recently, has been his consignment by Dante Alighieri to one of the nether regions of hell in the Inferno. In fact, Michael was a major translation of works of natural science and philosophy from Arabic to Latin. It is difficult to overestimate the role that these and other translators played in transferring the wealth of scholarship preserved, created, and analyzed in Al-Andalus from Arabic and Hebrew into Latin and later other European tongues. As noted in previous sections, many philosophical, mathematical, and scientific treatises had been translated earlier, and in both the Islamic Near East and the West. Scholars studying such texts and writing commentaries on Arabic, not to mention the original contributions of Arabic and Jewish scholars such as Ibn Tufayl, Ibn Rushd, and Isa ibn Mamun, or Maimonides, who produced an enormous library of learning that, as we've noted, and contemporary scholarship. It was the inestimable role of translation to convey this body of learning via Latin to the newly emerging institutions to the north, both ecclesiastical and academic. The linkage between the two being, of course, one of long standing. And I'd merely point out to you, as my wonderful late esteemed colleague at Penn, University of Pennsylvania, George McAtersey, did in his book, The Rise of the College. The first university we know is in Fez. It's the Qarawiyyin Mosque, founded in 860. And of course, classicists at this point out about academies in Rome and Athens and so on. Those are day schools. The principal point about the Islamic madrasa is firstly that there is an institution, a building with its faculty. Secondly, there is a hostel where students can come and stay. So you don't have to return home in the evening. There is a khan or hostel. The third thing and the most important is there is a waqf or an endowment. I raise this here because we go Fez, Toledo, Paris, Oxford. It's a direct line. And still today, much to the annoyance of the university authorities in Oxford and Cambridge, each college is a separate endowment and keeps its own endowment separately. And St John's College in Oxford has the best wine cellar in Oxford or Cambridge. But there we are. Anyway, yes. You tried it, Hassan, right? Yes. However, while the process of many of these Latin translations of philosophical, mathematical, and scientific works in European curricula has long been recognized, Ibn Sina's canon on medicine was being used in Paris in the 18th century. The more intricate and subtle paths taken by literary genre, admittedly more difficult to trace and at the same time subject to more intense religious and cultural sensitivities, has been less recognized or even explored. While such scholarly attitudes are in the process of change, as my frequent references to the work of Menokal has shown, there's still an urgent need for a more exacting study of not only the processes of translation itself, but also the potential ramifications of the presence in Al-Andalus of highly developed Arabic and Hebrew traditions of such significant genre as courtly love poetry and picaresque narrative. And now we come home to Beirut and also to Cairo in the 19th century. As we begin a brief discussion of translation movements in Beirut and Cairo in the 19th century, there are precursors to what may be termed the modern period, and we need first to identify those cultural phenomena. Some indications of the problems associated with the study of this lengthy pre-modern era, arguably between the 15th and 18th centuries, can be gauged from the work of a Damascene biographer, Al-Muhibbi, who in his Khulasat al-Athar, summary of works, provides biographies of some 1,289 prominent figures from the previous century in Damascus. Many of those writers about whom we know absolutely nothing. While the prevalence of Ottoman Turkish as the primary administrative language of large tracts of the Arabic-speaking world was certainly a factor, it's equally clear that the long-standing designation of this period as a kind of slough of despond for Arabic culture is in need of radical revision. I refer to the designation Asr al-Inhitat. One translation event during this pre-modern era, in Arabic world terms, may well be considered one of the most remarkable episodes in the whole of translation history. The arrival in Europe of the Arabic version of the Indo-European tale collection known as Alf Layla wa Layla, and later, and unfortunately in English, as the Arabian Nights, one of the massive misnomers in the entire history of providing names, in that it's Indo-Persian. No? Okay. We can fight afterwards, I said, okay. In the particular context of translation, it is important to realize that there are indeed two collections. The French Orientalist Antoine Guélan, having already published a translation of the separate Sinbad the Sailor Tales, turned his attention to a new manuscript he had acquired, the so-called 1001 Nights, which actually consisted of about 260 nights. He included in his Les Mille et Une Nuits, insisting on nuit being in the singular, as the Arabic was, published between 1704 and 1707, some other tales of Middle Eastern origin, including Sindbad, and indeed still others that are French pastiches with no Middle Eastern provenance, including two that, much to the disappointment of my students when I tell them, were to become most popular, namely Aladdin and Ali Baba. Sorry. The tale collection was publishing sensation of its time, giving rise to translations into virtually every European language, the emergence of the Oriental tale as a genre, and perhaps even to the emergence of Charles Perrault's fairy tales. Collections of Oriental poetry by Goethe, no less. Tributes to the storyteller Shahrazad in musical form by Rimsky-Korsakov and Ravel. And a whole field of Orientalist painting, with scantily clad odalisque figures as a major theme. My favorite here is probably Delacroix's Les Femmes d'Argent, which you probably know about, and where he had certain difficulty in finding any femme d'argent, and so he found a particular category of femme. But anyway, yes. It was the very success of this French collection and its subsequent translations into other languages that gave rise to a second movement, the aim of which was to supplement the original collection with enough tales to fill out the numerical 1001 Nights. Other tales of considerable variety were added, and an expanded, complete version inspired by European interest was among the first published works in Arabic by the newly opened Boulaq Press in Cairo in 1835. Translations of this second version of the Nights were now published, their adopted styles and translation methods ranging widely, reaching all the way to the downright prurient in the case of the, quote, anthropological footnotes, unquote, of Richard Burton's celebrated, or rather infamous, version. The original publication of that was contained in a brass case with a key so that the children of any family couldn't get at it. It now costs a great deal of money to get one of those, by the way, but anyway. I have drawn attention to this, okay, Asad, are you ready? Arabian Nights phenomenon, all right? Okay, happy now? Here, because quite apart from its impact on European culture, the image that it created, and in many ways continues to create, of the Orient as the exotic other was to play its part in the adoption of European mission civilisatrice, one that led newly industrializing nations to adopt notions of relative cultural advancement and backwardness, and to embark thereafter on colonial enterprises of different kinds. Such was certainly the case with another major translational event that is often regarded as marking the beginnings of a, quote, modern, unquote, era, at least in the case of Egypt, namely Napoleon's invasion of 1798. The major aim being to thwart British colonial investment and involvement in India. Napoleon brought with him not only translators to convert his speeches, all duly recorded by the Egyptian historian of the time, Abdurrahman al-Jabarti, but also a large team of scientists who recorded details of life in the country in the famous Description de l'Égypte, and engaged in debates with Egyptian intellectuals. What's perhaps most significant is the political vacuum that the French military withdrawal produced. Into it stepped Muhammad Ali, who, after eradicating the Mamluks who had ruled Egypt for centuries, founded a dynasty that was to rule Egypt until the 1952 revolution. Most important, he decided that Egypt needed an army like the French one that he had observed firsthand. He began sending young Egyptians on missions to Europe to learn the languages and, above all, to study weaponry. The young man sent to serve as imam of the first mission, Rafi Tahtawi, returned to Egypt with an excellent command of French and composed a record of experiences in France, Takhlis Lebris with Takhlis Paris. In our context, most significant is that Muhammad Ali appointed a Tahtawi director of a new translation school, Madrasat al-Alsan, in 1837. While initial translation activity involved French manuals and such fascinating topics as guns and military tactics, inevitably the translators themselves, being totally bored, were attracted to other types of texts. Thus, Tahtawi himself translated the work of the French theologian François Fénelon, Les Aventures de Télémaque, and one of his pupils, Mohammed Othman Jalal, took on the task of rendering many works of French literature into Arabic, including the fables of La Fontaine, and in this case, translation involved the process of tamsir, or Egyptianizing, many aspects of the original. Not only the language, but also the names of the principal characters. Molière's Tartuffe emerges as Sheikh Matlouf, and the Arabic version of Bernardin de Saint-Pierre's Paul et Virginie is given the lengthy Arabic title redolent of pre-modern eras. We noted earlier the long-standing connection between the Catholic Church in Rome and the Maronite community in Lebanon. With that in mind, the prominent role to be played by Lebanon and its capital of Beirut and its intellectual community in the fostering of translations is not a surprise. Initial efforts were much stimulated by the arrival in Lebanon of Christian missionaries from both the Church Missionary Society in England and the American Presbyterian Mission, each of whom was to make use of prominent intellectuals to assist them in projects to translate the Bible into Arabic.
Translators such as Eli Smith and later Cornelius van Dyck sought the assistance of such luminaries as Nasif al-Yazigi and Boutros al-Bastani, both of whom went on to become teachers. The former at the newly established Syrian Protestant College, subsequently named the American University in Beirut, the latter at the school that he himself founded, that's Bustani. The new availability of the press, and in both senses of that word, the possibility of printing and the foundation of newspapers provided a rapidly expanding venue for translations. Beginning with Hadiq al-Akhbar, a newspaper that started in 1858 and immediately set about serializing translations of French fiction, the number of newspapers, journals grew rapidly. Boutros al-Bustani himself established the journal Al-Jinan in 1870, and among the first works to be serialized was the novel written by the journal's editors, his son, Salim al-Bustani, namely Huyam fi Jinan al-Sham. The son was in fact also to contribute a large number of translations to the developing readership for works of fiction. And over the ensuing decades, many journals were founded to publish such serialized translations. Many of my colleagues are now working on these particular journals, particularly I mentioned Samah Salim, who has been working at the Wissenschaftskolleg or has been on that particular project. Alexandre Dumas' Pères, Le Comte de Monte Cristo, heavily indebted to the Arabian Nights aura, of course, that was mentioned earlier, was an initial candidate for translation, as were more famous historical novels by Sir Walter Scott. And while the French tradition may have provided the majority of texts for translation, later followed by the English, during the 20th century there was a growing interest in Russian fiction, prompted in no small part by the existence of Russian Orthodox academies in Syria and Palestine, to which the very famous Mikhail Nu'ayma went. During the 1850s and culminating in 1860s, sectarian strife in Syria led to the emigration of a large segment of the Christian population of this region. While many took up residence in Egypt, bringing their journalistic expertise and creative writings with us, others traveled further afield to England and to the Americas, in the latter case in the form of the Mahjar communities that were to play a major role as cultural translators in both directions and as important catalysts for generic formations in Arabic literature. I mentioned here I'm on the commission of the city of New York to commemorate the part of southern New York known as Little Syria. And we have just commissioned a memorial which will be erected on the site, which is ironically exactly one block from the World Trade Center. But it's still there, and the Church of St. George is still there on Washington Street if you happen to go to New York. It is a memory of a once thriving community coming from this particular region to the United States. In these sections, I've tried to illustrate the significant role that Arabic, as a language and as a cultural conduit, has played over the course of the centuries in preserving, interpreting, and translating the intellectual and literary traditions of its own heritage and that of other civilizations and regions with which it has come into contact. As the dynamics of cultural hegemony, whether real or perceived, have shifted over the course of the centuries with which we've been concerned here, the role of translation, the process of carrying across, translation, the values and cultural treasures of one culture to another, has transformed itself to match the perceived cultural imperatives of the particular time and place. If we indeed find ourselves today in an era termed post-colonial or post-something or the other, one in which the empire writes back, the title of a book recently published, then perhaps the movements and moments involving Arabic and translation that I've described here, albeit with reckless brevity, may come to be seen as occupying a more significant place within histories of Western civilization. Thank you.
you very, very much for this rich talk. A survey, really, a historical survey, very rich, but also giving us a lot of kind of pistes for further research, pointing to really where more research is much needed. Now, before we open up to questions, and I would like, I remember that I was asked to tell you that there is a list going around. Please fill your names and your emails so that we can contact you. So there's an email list, right? I think it's going around. Yeah. It's going around, yeah? Okay, good. I would also like to use this opportunity to announce that the English and the Arabic departments together are doing a lot and hopefully doing more even in the future to really introduce translation studies, and this means translation practices, histories and theories more to AUB. So we hope to, we already offer a minor, a joint minor, but we hope in the future to also have a diploma and to do much more. So we are very, very grateful for your input today and in the future. All right, so my question, having listened to this really very rich survey about the roles of cities such as Damascus, Baghdad, Toledo, Beirut, and Cairo, certainly I wonder, what is left today? What are the centers today? And what can we do? How can we draw on this very rich history? Certainly you mentioned at the end of your talk that there needs to be much more research to kind of unearth this history. But I'm wondering also, what can we do with this history to promote further translation activity here at AUB and elsewhere?
As I think we've discussed this before, throughout my career, which is now essentially over, but has lasted the last 50 years or so, I've become more and more aware of the patterns of research which are undertaken, and the perhaps unfortunate way in which the patterns of research undertaken by Western scholars in particular are very much a reflection of patterns of colonialism, and along with the patterns of colonialism, the existence of cultural centers in different parts of the Arabic-speaking world. So that it's actually rather refreshing for me, having spent maybe the first almost 2/3 of my career specializing essentially in the literature of Egypt, to make a conscious decision in the middle of the 1990s to completely switch my focus to Morocco. Why? Because Morocco essentially has been left in terms of the study of Arabic literature to scholars in France and Spain. And that there are various patterns, as I said to you earlier today, if I am asked who has written about contemporary literature in the Yemen, if I pose this as a sort of teaser question, I think I would draw blanks in most cases. The answer, of course, is that there are a number of scholars in Italy who are specifically working on Yemeni literature, but only in Italy. So what we've seen recently, and what I've seen, and why I have told Syracuse University Press that it's quite impossible for me now to write a third edition of my book on the Arabic novel, is that there are far too many cultural centers thriving now in order to bring everything together. That's the good part about it. The bad part about it is that the study of those cultural centers and their production has not adjusted to the availability of such riches. So that, for example, working now on what I would call the Khaliji novel, the Saudi novel, the Sudanese novel, or I'm talking about the novel since this is what I'm primarily interested in, both as a critic and as a translator. But ironically, this is directly reflected in the ability of scholars to go to those particular areas. And the means by which that has happened is, of course, through research centers. Now, Cairo has 27 research centers, which are funded by different Western governments of various kinds. Now, of course, for a long time, Beirut has had the incredibly illustrious German Institute here, which has done a great deal of work in the field. But what about Syria? You know, much of the Syrian literature, it seems to me, has also been done somewhat by the French, but again, primarily by the Italians, as far as I can see. So what I'm trying to say here is, I am thrilled that there is so much emerging cultural and literary activity in a far broader spectrum than I have ever been able to cover, particularly in my book on the Arabic novel, making it impossible for me to consider doing that. I quoted, of course, the fact that my esteemed supervisor, Mustafa Badawi at Oxford, was the editor of the Cambridge History of Arabic Literature's volume on modern Arabic literature. He contacted me and asked me to write a chapter, and it's in the modern Arabic literature volume. It's called The Arabic Novel Outside Egypt. And I think, I now look back on that and think, what a concept. You know, there's Egypt where everything happens, and then there's the rest. You see, my point is, if that was even plausible at one point, it's totally implausible now. In fact, funnily enough, in reflecting on some of the translation prizes and the novel prizes which are available, the fact that Egyptians have not thus far won any of the prestigious prizes may be somewhat problematic, at least in Egypt, but those prizes and the awards which have been made and the authors they've been given to seem to reflect a very different approach to, on the part of indigenous scholars, to the Arabic creativity min al-Khalij al-Muhit. Fine. The scholarship somehow has got to catch up, and it hasn't done so yet. There's still these patterns, and until we can open cultural centers, or at least enable students to go to these areas and involve themselves in the critical tradition and the creative tradition, it's not going to change, unfortunately.
Well, the nice thing is that we also have an increasing number of students coming out of these areas.
Yes, right.
So, all right, so I open the floor for discussion. I'm sure there are many questions. I see Rana, please go ahead.
Thank you so much for a wonderful, comprehensive survey of the field. I wanted to ask you started with Kilito and with this idea of translation as a conflict between civilizations and languages, and indeed the cultures that the translation movements that you do talk about are in one way the result of conflict and war, imperial domination and overtake, appropriation. But at the same time, you are a translator, and I want to ask you about your role. So looking back at Kilito as a translator, someone who is a happy traitor, as you also call them, how would you, is that the only thing we could talk about? Is the only way we could understand this? Because what you just also given us today is that this civilization it prevails over the historical conflicts in one sense.
We can talk about the translation process itself, I think, but probably the place where this comes home to roost is in the third phase, the target culture phase, and the process of trying to persuade some publishing house to publish it. As you were speaking, I was reminded of Edward Said being asked in New York to prepare a list of novels for translation by a New York publisher, and submitted it to the publisher, and then inquired about 6 weeks later as to whether anything had happened, and the publisher said, no, Arabic's a controversial language. Well, I mean, if Arabic's a controversial language, then khalas. So certainly in the third phase, the target culture phase, there are confrontations and there are antagonisms. But in the translation process itself, obviously there are confrontations of language. But I think Abdel Fattah, of course, likes being provocative. I mean, if you've ever spoken to him, you know that he loves being provocative, and all his books are refreshing precisely for that particular quality. But I would see this cultural confrontation as being the primary problem in the field of translation. And just to say, I currently have 4 translated texts for which I have not been able to find a publishing house, because, in many cases, because we seem now to be in the phase of publishing prize-winning novels and nothing else. And that of course becomes somewhat dangerous if such pressure is put on these translation prizes to produce novels which are going to be publishable. In other words, Janine Dabashi wrote once an article about Arab authors writing novels for translation. That the novel is not actually written for its target culture, its host culture, it's written for its a target culture. I'm not sure I would go that far. But I'm reminded too of Schleiermacher's great statement about foreignizing the reader. I firmly believe that there's no point in translating a text which is going to sound and look familiar to the person who's reading it. What's the point? I mean, they can read something in their own culture. The purpose of translation is to confront the reader with difference. Or as Schleiermacher says, to foreignize the reader. So that definitely there is that process of at least confrontation there, saying, yes, this is different, but get used to it, because you're reading a translation, and that is a primary purpose of a translated text, is to confront the reader with difference.
More questions?
I wanted to address that point you mentioned. From your very wide reading, do you notice that modern Arabic novels already cater to the gallery of publishers, to the Western taste?
Yes.
Do you notice this guy is speaking? For instance, I noticed in Adonis's poetry when he started writing in France, you see that he's talking now to the French reader, and not, although writing in Arabic. In 86, his very first long poem, you feel that it's written for the Western reader. Do you feel that in the novel?
Yes, in certain cases. I mean, and I've written about 2 that are famous and or notorious. One is Amart Yaqubian, and the second one, even worse, is Banat Riyadh, which I confess to you, I was asked to translate Banat Riyadh, and I read it and wrote back and said, I'm sorry, but Marilyn Booth, bless her heart, has never forgiven me, because I suggested that they ask Marilyn Booth, and she actually did it. But Marilyn Booth, who wrote a stinging letter to the Times Literary Review. I mean, if we want to talk about translators and translation, this is a really interesting incident, because Penguin sent her translation, and she had taken great effort to reflect the Saudi colloquial. The authoress took all the Saudi colloquial out of the English text, all of it, sent it to the publisher, and then insisted on being listed as the first translator. If you look at the Penguin version of that text, you will see that Raja' Saleh is listed as the first translator. Marilyn Booth is the second translator. That's absolutely outrageous. Quite apart from the zift quality of the book itself. You know, I mean, khalas, yeah, I mean, sorry, I mean, women writing in Arabic can do better than that. And they, of course, I mean, the list, I could go on and on. I mean, where do you want to start? But the list of amazing female Arab novelists is out there, but that is just a disservice. And publishing it is a disservice.
I saw a number of hands go up. I don't know.
Oh dear, I probably offended some people now.
So, sorry, I don't know your name, and then afterwards Rita, and then someone else over here, yes.
Well, I would like to ask a general question, you know. You spoke about Toledo, about Junisabur and other cities as like in a strategic cultural sense, you know. I would like to understand what do you think about the future historiography of the Google Translate. What do you think?
Oh my gosh.
How will we be writing the history of this moment after 500 or 600 years? You know? Well, since you work on translations in a cultural and political and spatial sense, you spoke about spatial sense.
The problem I face in answering that question is, of course, to wonder whether before too long we're going to be publishing anything. In book form, I mean, that's a fascinating question, but it's not one I really feel qualified to answer because the move away from physical textuality towards virtual textuality comes with a whole load of issues concerning, for example, mechanical translation and things like that. I am at least relieved to realize that translation, one of the first things I say, or used to say in my translation seminar was, translation has to be a massive act of interpretation. There's no such thing as literal translation. And if there is, يمطر القطط والكلاب doesn't sound too good in Arabic. I mean, it doesn't work in Arabic, right? Being British, of course, you know, I was used to saying it's raining cats and dogs, but you know, it doesn't somehow work in Arabic. So literal, I mean, there are just so many examples of the fiascos brought about by literal translations, you know, and things. But this radical change of medium and the ephemerality of it are things which make it impossible for me to gauge what the future is going to look like. And these days I'm continually saying to the younger generation here, tafaddalu, you know, have fun with it, but you know, I primarily look backwards these days at what has happened, and I know what is happening, and I know about, till recently, my students and how they access texts and so on, but the changes are so profound that I can't really gauge what is going to happen. I mean, that's not a very satisfactory answer, but it's the only one I can give.
Rita?
Hi. So I'm in Dr. Sonia's class, Modernism, and we're reading Najib Mahfouz's Karnak. Some of us are reading the English, some of us are reading the Arabic version. My question is, so Najib won the Nobel Prize in 1988.
Yes.
And you translated it in 2007. So my question is, why the gap? Why wasn't it translated after it won?
Firstly, I was Mahfouz's recommender for the Nobel Prize. I'm a correspondent of the Swedish Academy. So, yes, I was heavily involved in that, in spite of everybody's attempts to say that everybody recommended him. But I have textual evidence to the effect from the Swedish Academy, right? The answer is very simple. When Najib Mahfouz won the Nobel Prize, he sat down with the directors of the American University in Cairo Press and made a list, a prioritized list of his novels and their translation. And Al-Karnak was not one of his favorites. It's very sensational, of course. It's probably one of his angriest novels. He loathed Anwar Sadat. He detested Anwar Sadat. You know, I forget which novel it is, but it's from that period where he says, the uniform is Hitler, but the gestures are Charlie Chaplin. I mean, yeah. Of course, as you probably know, when the Nobel Prize was announced, the Thulathiyya, the trilogy, was not available in English. The Nobel Committee read it in French. And they read 2 volumes of it in French. They didn't read, Sukaria had not come out in French. Philippe Vigueux, it's a wonderful translation. But thereafter, I mean, the American University Press was in contact with me, and they made me do Khan al-Khalili first. I did Khan al-Khalili because they wanted the earliest novel done, and Al-Karnak had to wait. And the last one I did was Al-Baqi min Zaman Sa'a. I'd already done Suman wa Kharif a long time, and Maraya. But no, Al-Karnak had to wait because AUC Press decided that it had to wait its turn. And they didn't want, Mahfouz wanted the novels to come out in a very particular order after the Nobel Prize.
So it was his decision?
It was his decision, totally his decision, yes. He's the first, I think, and the only Arab author who's ever been able to dictate when a particular work comes out. You know, of course, many Arab authors are very pleased when anything comes out, but I mean, he, in translation. But he was able to dictate precisely what the order of his novels was going to be. As you probably know, they're now all translated, all of them. Yeah.
Yes, Robert. I'm sorry. Sorry. Actually, next to you, the person next to you. No. She was before you, but sorry. So.
Good evening. Can you hear me?
No, there's noise just above us here. So.
Okay. Well, as you know, cultural differences are the main difficulties faced by translators. So my question is, how were you able to translate Arabic literature, which is greatly based on cultural references, but you didn't actually live in the Arab world? How could you adapt these references?
That's a very difficult question in terms of both the interpretation of the text itself. And I have to say, I've never translated any Arabic work of fiction where I have not a personal relationship with the author. So, as I say, except for Al-Mu'ilhi, who died in 1930, but I was in touch with his family. I mean, but you don't want to get into the intentional fallacy of saying, okay, the author tells me what the text means. No. But I have spent significant amounts of time in Egypt and now in Morocco, making a particular conscious effort to get some idea about the local culture. The process in that third target culture phase is then, how do you insert the cultural difference into the translated text? And that's a war zone. It's a war zone between translators and publishers. I tend to agree that footnotes in translation are not a good idea. So my policy is have a glossary at the back, and there's a little asterisk in the text. If you want to find out the details, you can go to the back and find it out. People say, well, that's a pain in the neck going backwards and forwards. But the alternative, you see, is, for example, the inserted explanation. And the English translation of Mahfouz's trilogy does that. It solemnly says, I entered Shara al-Nahasin or Coppersmith Street. That's in the English. Well, there's no street in Cairo I've ever seen called Shara al-Nahasin or Coppersmith Street. And that's quite apart from, you know, the translation of the titles of the Thulathiyya. Bain al-Qasrayn is the name of a street. Qasr al-Shawq, even worse, is the name of a street. The English title, Palace of Desire. Alf Layla wa Layla, right there. Right? It's right there. And as I say in an article, have you heard of a street in Paris called the Elysian Fields? I haven't. I know it in English fiction as the Champs-Élysées, right? So why? Here's this thing about cultural difference and cultural distance. Why can't we call it a novel Bain al-Qasrayn or Qasr al-Shawq or a Suqariyya? Quite apart from Jacqueline Onassis' choice, she was the editor, do you know that? Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis was the editor of the Thulathiyya of Mahfouz in English. The choice of pictures on the cover is a total disaster. Suqariyya is in Old Cairo, right? So why do we have a picture of a bus in Talat Harb Square on the cover? It's completely wrong, totally wrong. So I've always tried to make sure that I am familiar with the cultural environment. For example, I've just translated, and I haven't found a publisher yet, Ahmad al-Tawfiq is the Minister of Religious Affairs in Morocco, and he's Amazigh, and he's from the way south. So I have been to the way south, over the Atlas Mountains and into the desert region beyond the Atlas Mountains to see what it feels like and what the villages look like and so on. And quite apart from the various kasabas which are there, I mean, it's very impressive, don't get me wrong, I love doing it, but that gives a certain cultural authenticity, and I can think about that as I try to render it into English. And then, as I say, you have to make decisions, and there are a variety of decisions as to how you convey that in the actual printed English text. There are a number of strategies as to what you do. And that's between you and the publisher.
Robert.
First, I simply wanted to thank you for being Maria Rosa-Minokal's professor. I was her student, so I benefited from your wisdom indirectly.
I didn't ask her to translate The Lame Girl is in the Yellow Room, I'll tell you that. She would not have liked that at all. Yes.
Well, my questions depart from sort of two of her sort of concept. Number one is, I was back at Yale for something else a couple of years ago, shortly before she passed away, and she was very emphatic in believing that the transfer of Said's ideas related to Orientalism from the social sciences in 18th and 19th century France and Britain to, for example, the arts more generally, or to the Iberian Peninsula, was actually a very unfortunate process that's taken place, number one. And that a lot of the impediments that you're describing in translation, they take place in, Russian to, Portuguese, from whatever, the idea that somehow or another this is a particular case of transmission is something that is the legacy of Said. I'm not saying I agree with it, but I found it very interesting. The other thing that sort of came out of studying with her, and it's something that you brought up, is of course the continuity in Latin America of so many texts in Spanish and Portuguese, and the traditions that you point to, whether lyric poetry or the framed tale, are oral, and therefore it would seem that there would be a particularly close relationship between Spanish, Portuguese, and Arabic, which is understudied, especially, and we're doing it in a graduate seminar on Latin America, that continuity is very much there, and the more I look, the more surprised I am to find it. So if you comment on either of those things.
I think Edward Said's Orientalism is a monument of the time in which it came out. And I think it was a major gesture, a major poke in the eye of more traditional approaches to the study of the Middle East in general. A number of people, you've probably read Robert Irwin's demolition job on it. I think it's definitely possible to challenge what Edward is doing in that book on a number of different counts. And the sort of situation you mentioned is certainly one which I think has validity, and I suspect very strongly that if Edward had been able to meet Maria and talk to her, he would probably have adjusted his own views, because he was never completely fixed in his own views. So yes, I think you raise a valid point there, that and I would agree with Maria's notion about the need to revisit what Edward was talking about. As regards your second point, the entire issue of orality in dealing with the Arabic literary tradition is vastly understudied and really potentially can bring about enormous processes of change in our understanding. I mean, let's start with the pre-Islamic poetry. You know, and the fact that, Michael Zwettler started it, of course, with his famous book ages ago, but the oral tradition, of course, is very difficult to pin down unless somebody actually records descriptions of the oral process taking place. You know, I'm reminded of a great deal of research which has been going on about the current tradition of improvised oral poetry in the Arabian Peninsula and the Gulf. Clive Hole's Kerpershirk, and I've forgotten that there's a Saudi scholar who was at Berkeley who also wrote about the oral tradition of poetry in Saudi Arabia today. But this oxymoron, which is oral literature, you know, literature implying writing, but orality implying something else, and that oral tradition in Spain is merely one of the instances in the connection between Arabic and both its own culture and another culture is simply another instance of an area where there's a whole lot of work to be done still before. But I mean, it seems to me the Hispanists' view that, and the Romance scholars' view that suddenly the troubadour tradition just suddenly pops out in Poitiers or somewhere, just seems to be completely ignoring patterns of cultural interchange during that period. And, well, as you know, the Hispano-Arabic war, which has been going on for ages, I don't know if you should read the interchange between Alan Jones. Well, Alan Jones's famous article about Garcia Gomez is the emperor has no clothes. I mean, no. But a whole series of studies, really nasty studies, poking holes in the theory in either direction. Maria tried to occupy a central space, and that was a crucial role, and nobody really has taken her place in doing that. But somebody needs to do so that we can actually get some clarity about these traditions of Hispano-Arabic literature in poetic form and also in picaresque form, because the implications of that tradition are huge for Western culture.
Do we have more questions?
One quick question.
Yeah, I see two more questions, yes?
It's a quick question. Basically, thank you for this talk. It was a real eye-opener. And when you mentioned Richard Burton's translation of Alf Layla O Layla, you described it as infamous.
Yes.
In what way infamous?
Because of its propensity for making not necessarily valid sexual references out of every other, well, anyway. No, the footnotes are renowned, absolutely renowned. His footnotes, they're called anthropological footnotes. Anybody here in anthropology? Please don't take that the wrong way. But they're not anthropological, believe me. They're about, it's all about sex and sensuality and stuff, which of course, it's the most famous translation of all, which is a big shame, and gives rise to all this art which
and
comes out.
Victorians felt the need to look it up somehow.
Yes, yes. So the children couldn't read it. Yes.
Childproof.
Yes. And as I say, to get that collection now with the lock, it costs thousands of dollars or pounds to get one. Yeah. I've only seen one in my life, but yes. It was deeply impressive, the fact that there is this phenomenon, yes.
I think Rola and Samar, did you have a question?
I was just going to say that my father had a copy of Richard
He did.
in Baghdad, and it's still there. I remember it was black and gold.
Mm-hmm.
Library. It's still very vivid in my imagination.
Did you read it? Yeah, you did. Uh-huh. And the footnotes? Don't remember the footnotes. Taib. That's a very good answer. Yes.
So we have Rola, and then I saw one more question, and it comes from a student of mine. So
Okay.
We'll take one more question afterwards, please.
Well, my question is about your statement about the purpose of translation is to confront the readers with difference. Are there any gray areas within that difference? And who decides? I mean, I'm not talking about the translation ultimately reaching a publisher. It may not be published. But in the academic field, let's say students are translating and not necessarily having their translations published later. What are the shades of tolerance within that difference that the translation is supposed to confront the students or the readers with? What makes or breaks it? Is it syntactical? Is it elements of register, elements of, you know, a graceful style? What are the...
It's mostly cultural references, I think. There is occasionally an instinct towards saying, okay, the reader won't understand this, so I'll simply leave it out. And my first meeting with Naguib Mahfouz began with him asking me, what do you think of the translation of Zuhaq al-Midaq? And I said, well, you know, it's your first novel, and it's come out from Beirut, it came out from Khayat, translated by Trevor Legassic, and he said, he left out all the Islamic references. So all alhamdulillah, nasrullah, blah, 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 all that was left out, and he said, I don't like, you know, that's part and parcel of what it is to be an Egyptian having a conversation, talking about health or whatever it is. And I don't like that. So next time I saw Trevor, I said, you know, I saw Naguib Mahfouz and he didn't like what you've done. And Trevor said, okay, I'm doing a reprint, I'll put some of it back in. He didn't put all of it back in it, but he put some of it back in. So Zuhaq al-Midaq, the Trevor Legassic's translation now is not, if you compare the original Khayat of 1966 with the later one, they're not quite the same. And that's because you're making decisions primarily about, well, it's a judgment as to how distant is a certain cultural phenomenon from your understanding of the target culture, and how do you handle that? And that's a matter of interpretation, essentially, which is one of the roles, the major role of the translator.
One last question, Rana.
First of all, thank you so much for the talk.
My pleasure.
My question is basically on translated works placed, or as opposed to their original versions. As an undergraduate student, when I was an undergraduate student, my professor would always tell me, if we were reading translated works, they would say, read the originals, they're always better. So I was just wondering whether your input on this, since you're a translator, and also whether you should be comparing them in this particular way.
If you can read the original, I think obviously read the original. But I have an interesting story about one of the authors I've translated, Jabra Ibrahim Jabra. I've translated Safina, and I translated Al-Bahth an Walid Mas'ud. And he, of course, is a superb translator of English into Arabic. He translated into Arabic all Shakespeare's tragedies and Shakespeare's sonnets into Arabic poetry. He's a superb translator. But when our translation of Safina came out, he said, you know, your translation is better than my original. And we said, what? He had some suggestions, because his English was better than mine. I mean, it's superb in English. He's had an MA in English literature and wrote his first 3 novels. I don't know, his first 3 novels were written in English. The Arabic versions of his first 3 novels are translations not done by him. But here's why he said so. He said, it's a novel of voices. And Al-Bahth an Walid Mas'ud is even more a novel of voices. It's 12 voices. And he said, I'm the single author, and I wrote the separate voices of the separate narrators. You, 2 translators, were able to take one voice and be the first translator of it, and then give it to your colleague as the second translator, so that the English reads indeed as though there are 2 separate voices through the differences in the nuances of language, which he was not able to do himself with the original. He didn't say, okay, now I'm writing a different character, therefore I'll write in a different style or have a... So he said, actually, for both of those novels, our version was his preferred version rather than his own original. So that's a sort of counter-example, but obviously if you can read the original, that's where you start. And then maybe compare it with the translation. Yeah.
Thank you. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And again, hopefully we'll have more talks and workshops in translation given by Professor Roger Allen, and a concert in the future.
Okay, okay. Do we have somebody from the Fersley family here? Yes? No? Nobody? Okay. The Fersley family. Fersley. Yeah. Okay. Oh, yes. I thought... Not to worry.
Thank you so much. A pleasure to meet you finally. And I hope our paths cross again. Yes, absolutely. Have a great